let's just spend a moment and talk a little bit about close reading, the four different areas that we look at when we're looking at evaluating literature, and some of the tools that we use in order to be effective in that evaluation. And first, let's review what we're talking about when we talk about a close reading. Obviously, a close reading is being very careful, very intentional, and very purposeful in what we're trying to do in evaluating a piece of literature. And in reality, what we're doing is we're rereading a text because we're going to be looking at that text more than once. And we're looking for specific things. We're looking at what the author had to say, what the author's purpose was, what the words mean, and what the structure of the text tells us. One of the tools I'm just using, highlighting or underlining, or a little bit of both, is one of the tools that we talked about in terms of getting general information or general ideas as we're going along in a text. So, important idea about close reading, underline and highlight, main ideas. Okay, let's go on. So, how do we do a close reading? And what are some of those key things that we want to consider as we read along? We want to consider the language, we want to think about the narrative, we want to think about the syntax, and we want to think about the context. All four of those are very, very important when it comes to doing a literary analysis. So let's move on and talk a little bit about each one. First of all, language, which is diction, is very, very important. Diction means word choice. And the author is very intentional again as to words that he chooses. And what we're looking at is we're kind of like a detective, and we're looking for patterns of what that author uses in order to determine what the actual meaning is or the theme of that work. So, what did the author repeat? That will indicate a pattern. What was emphasized? Again, going and looking for a pattern. What kind of language is used? And when I'm talking about kind of language, I'm talking about whether it's formal or informal, whether it's slang, whether it's figurative language, which is more connotative, or mood words, or what words are important to the understanding of the thesis and the theme. Symbols, all that kind of imagery, all kind of going to contribute to the ultimate theme or message of the story. And all are really, really important. When we're talking about the narrative story, we're talking about something that's very, very important and sometimes overlooked. But the narrative part is all about point of view. And that point of view will impact how the story is told and how the story is received. We talk about verisimilitude, or the idea of being truthful. That point of view will add to that or take away from that. So what are we talking about? We're talking about who is telling the story. Is it someone who was actually there, a main character, or a minor character? From what perspective point of view is the story being told? In other words, is it that person, or is it a second person point of view where someone's telling someone else directly? Or is it the third person limited, which means that we're following one person but we're knowing everything about that person? Or more of an omniscient, which is going to sort of push the reader away from the actual action, but sometimes we need that emotional distance in order to preserve our own peace of mind as we're going through a story that's very intense. How is the story told? And what motivates the narrative to tell the story in this manner? There's always those considerations that we have to keep in mind. Syntax, the word order, again, is going to be very important. It's going to be the arranging of those words that's going to make a difference, and again, we can find a pattern. So, does the author use standard American English? Why would the author use non-standard syntax? When we talk about non-standard syntax, we're talking about changing the order of the sentence. Sometimes what an author will do, or a writer, is take the subject and use it after the verb, which is sort of inverting the order. Why would you do that? If you're trying to create suspense or tension, then that will do that, because if we hear the verb first, the first thing that we naturally want to do is find out who's doing that, and that immediately creates a sense of suspense and intensity. Who is the audience? And how does that writing style affect the audience? These are all key components in considering the literature and whether it's successful or effective. Again, the context is the fourth thing, which is we have to consider. What happens around it? What's happened to the writer will give us some perspective on what he's writing about. So what is the setting of the story, both within the story and externally from the writer's perspective? What's the background of the author? In what environment was the story written? What was happening at the time of the story? All of these are very important considerations. So whether we're talking about the context, the syntax, the the background of the story. Any of these things are going to be important. And we talked about tools. The tools included highlighting and underlining to get general ideas, being able to paraphrase to make sure we understand what's going on in the story, being able to descriptively outline as we go along in margins to kind of summarize some of the key things and also point out key details and evidence that we need to know, and also being able to reflect or kind of sit back after we've done our analysis and decide, how did that story make us feel, or how did we react or respond to that story? If you can do all of these things, you can successfully read a story and come up with a sense of what that message or theme is. And that's what understanding and appreciating literature is all about.